They did not make an announcement. There was no farewell post, no long caption about needing space, no, taking a break, be back soon. One day, they were just there, and then at some point, quietly, without telling anyone, they stopped. And the strange thing is, nobody could tell you exactly when it happened. That is how silent it was. You only noticed the absence much later, when you went looking and realized you could not remember the last time you had seen them there. You probably know someone like this. Or maybe, and I think this is more likely if you are watching this video, you are someone like this. And if you are, I need you to stay with me. Because what I am about to tell you is not what anyone has said about this before. Not the think pieces about digital detox. Not the wellness content about screen time. Not the people who called you antisocial or weird or said you were missing out. This is the actual psychology of why certain people quietly vanish from social media and never come back. And it starts not with social media at all, but with something that happened long before any of these platforms existed. The first thing most people get completely wrong about the person who disappeared is the reason. They assume depression, or arrogance, too good for it, above it all. Or that something happened, some drama, some event big enough to explain the exit. And almost none of that is ever true. The person who disappears quietly is almost never running from something external. They are protecting something internal, and to understand what they are protecting, you have to go back much further than their last post. Because here is what the research actually shows, and here is what nobody in this conversation ever says directly. The people who genuinely cannot sustain a social media presence, who feel something close to real discomfort when they are too visible, who find the whole architecture of posting and being seen and being measured genuinely exhausting rather than mildly annoying. These people almost always share one specific psychological history. At some point, early enough to become wired into how they move through the world, they learned that being fully seen was not safe. Not physically, not dramatically, but in the quiet, accumulating way that childhood teaches its most permanent lessons. The way you learn that your emotions make the adults around you uncomfortable. The way you learn that sharing something honest invites judgment faster than it invites connection. The way you slowly understand, through enough small moments of opening up followed by some form of pain, that the version of yourself that is hardest to hurt is the version that cannot be fully seen. And social media is the complete opposite of that. Social media is a stage with lighting and an audience and a live scoreboard. Every post is a deliberate act of visibility, a choice to be seen by people you know, people you have never met, people who knew you once and are now watching from a distance they never announced. For most people, that is fine. But for the person who spent years learning that visibility carries risk, that combination of stage and audience and algorithm deciding how many people see what you just made yourself vulnerable enough to share does not feel like connection. It feels like standing in a room where every exit has been quietly locked. But the second layer is not about fear at all. The person who disappeared is not necessarily afraid of being judged. Some of them genuinely do not care what strangers think. What they are protecting is something far more specific than their reputation. It is something social media quietly takes from every person who uses it, without asking, without warning, without ever showing you the cost until the damage is done. Their interior life. The private, unperformed part of themselves that exists without an audience. The part that thinks without first deciding what the thought should look like. The part that feels without calculating whether the feeling is presentable. Social media does not just ask you to share your life. It asks you to translate your life to take the raw, complicated reality of who you are and compress it into something that can be liked or scrolled past. For most people, that translation is not particularly costly. But for the person with a genuinely rich interior world, someone whose inner life has depth and nuance that does not compress into a caption without losing everything that made it real, that translation is not just difficult. It is a kind of quiet violence. The slow violence of being asked every single day to make yourself smaller than you are, to fit a format that was never built for someone like you. Now, the third layer. This is the one I have never heard named in any video or article on this topic. The person who disappeared is often someone who noticed something the rest of the feed either did not notice or chose to ignore. They noticed what long-term social media use was doing to the way they understood themselves. Not the obvious version, the "I feel bad seeing someone's holiday photos" version. Everyone knows that version. This is the deeper one. Every time they opened the app, they came out of it with a slightly different sense of who they were. Slightly smaller, slightly more managed, more curated, more comparable, and that version did not match the person they were when nobody was watching. And over time they noticed the gap between those two versions was not staying the same. It was growing. Every month, every year of continued use, the gap got wider. And at some point they made a decision. Not a grand principled stance, just a quiet, private, completely personal decision to stop letting a platform determine the shape of who they were. Psychologists call this identity fragmentation, the gradual splitting of a person's self-concept into the version that exists in real life and the version that exists online. For most people, this fragmentation is manageable. The two versions stay close enough that the split is never felt. But for people with a strong, clear sense of self, the fragmentation becomes intolerable. Because every time the online version gets more recognition than the real one, every time a photograph gets more response than the actual moment it came from, something shifts. And the person starts to feel in a way they cannot name that the platform is consuming something irreplaceable. And so they leave, not dramatically, with the quiet certainty of someone who finally understood that what they actually are is worth more than what they can be persuaded to perform. And here's what everyone around them gets completely wrong about what happens next. Leaving social media is not the same as leaving the world. The person who disappeared from the feed did not become isolated. For most of them, the exact opposite happened. When they stopped performing their life for an audience, they started actually living it. The conversation that went 3 hours and nobody took a picture. The morning that was genuinely good and stayed completely private. The feeling that was allowed to simply be felt without being translated into content, without waiting for external confirmation that it was worth feeling. What they found on the other side was not emptiness. It was something they had nearly forgotten was their own signal, the specific frequency of their own interior life, finally audible again after years of being drowned out by the noise of the feed. Uninterrupted, unmanaged, entirely theirs. You did not disappear. You stopped being visible to people who were never genuinely seeing you in the first place. And that is not a loss. That is one of the quietest and most deliberate acts of self-preservation a person can perform in a world that monetizes human attention and calls the transaction connection. If this video put words to something you have carried for a long time without being able to explain it, this is what this channel is. Every week, always this deep, always this honest. Welcome to Decoded Psyche. Join now.